Thanks, Skylar. And good evening to everyone that is attending here physically and watching online. You are so welcome, and I'm so pleased that you have come out tonight or tuned in tonight to take part in our carol service. My name is Josh, and I'm one of the leaders of Hope Church Lancaster. And hey, what a fantastic, awesome year we have had. No? Just me then. A few people are down here that really enjoyed lockdown, you weirdos. It hasn't been a great year, has it? It hasn't been a great year. And, like many others, probably in the room and watching online, you probably had many hopes and aspirations at the start of the year, like I did. There were things I wanted to do this year. There were places I wanted to go. There were people I wanted to see. And then, like with you, I slowly saw all of those hopes and aspirations slowly sail far away as the tidal wave of COVID-19 hit our shores. And I'm just wondering, what were your initial hopes and aspirations at the start of this year? What did you hope to see this year? What did you hope to accomplish this year? Maybe you had some high hopes. Perhaps you had the hope to go on a luxury holiday, but then the only exotic options you were left with were the great culinary capital of your kitchen, or the great wild grandeur and expanse of your unkept garden. Or maybe the arts and entertainment center of your living room. Or maybe you just wanted to have some me time this year. Maybe you dropped down to part-time at work, or you took some time off work, hoping to have some me time for the first time in your life. But that was easily soaked up by having to homeschool your kids and teach them primary school English and maths and different types of geometry, and all the time wondering how on earth you made it through school in the first place. Or maybe you had the hope to get fit and healthy this year, to get into a trim shape, but during lockdown you ate your own body weight and your partner's body weight in hobnobs. It is true that during lockdown, or some say that the only options available to us were to become a hunk, not like me, a monk, or a chunk. So which one did you choose during lockdown? Apparently those were the only options. I had my own challenges as well. My wife was she works at the RLI, so she was one of these special key workers who swanned off to work every day, and I had to work from home with a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old to contend with. And let's face it, not a lot of proper work is going to get done when I'm trying to look after a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. But I knew I had to get clever about this. I knew I had to get smart and tactical, so I had a strategy. When I knew I had a conference call coming up, I would build an elaborate den in the living room. I would prepare some snacks, some treats, some drinks, and some food. I would put said snacks in the den. I would take the children and put them in the den as well. And I'd run into the kitchen, close the door, and jump on my conference call, hoping to have an hour's peace. But lo and behold, 5 minutes later, they would come through demanding more snack. I believe in 1 hour that my 1-year-old came through 5 times demanding more juice. I mean, he's only 1.5 foot tall. I mean, how much juice can a 1.5 foot tall person drink? But it turns out to be quite a lot. So they were my struggles anyway during our first lockdown. But joking aside, this has been a very difficult and a sobering year for many, hasn't it? For many, this has been one of the most difficult years of their life. And as a nation, even as the world, we've had to cope with the distress, with the uncertainty, with the change, with the chaos of it all. And by no means has it been a good year. By no means has it been an easy year, a comfortable year. The last reading that we just had from our American friend Skylar, big up America, was from Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, writing around 700 BC about the time of the Hebrew people, when they were going through a very dark time of their own. They were going through a very distressing time, a very chaotic time, a very uncertain time of their own, the Hebrew people. And in many ways, we find ourselves in a very similar situation. Now, theirs was a time mostly of their own making, but one filled with great distress and uncertainty likewise. But we find ourselves in a similar situation, because I don't know if you spotted what Skylar read out and what Barbara read out in our video. And by the way, Barbara just randomly chose that passage as well, whilst I'd already chosen to speak on that this evening, which was a great coincidence. Isaiah spoke to those who were poor. Isaiah spoke to those who were poor. Maybe you've been hit financially during this time. Maybe you've lost your job, or your business that you wanted to start in the hospitality sector, has had to close its doors permanently, not just for lockdown. Maybe you've been hit financially. Maybe you've had to use the food bank for the first time in your life, which is no shame at all. It's there to be used, but it's rocked your world a little bit. Or maybe you're the single mum sat at home, not being able to afford to put the heating on until your kids get back home from school because it's worth it for them. For many in this country, we've tasted a sense of what poverty can feel like. We've tasted a sense of what poorness can feel like. There's been a 61 increase in food parcels this winter, so much so that 6 are being handed out every minute. That's 1 every 10 seconds. Food parcels being handed out. So as a nation, we've tasted the harshness of this year. Isaiah spoke to those who were brokenhearted as well. Maybe you've been separated from your loved ones this year, from your family, from your friends. We all have to a certain degree. My heart goes out to the couple further down south who separated themselves, self-isolated themselves from their young son because they both worked in the hospital. For multiple weeks, isolating themselves from immediate family members. Or I think of the 2 women who busted their granny out of a care home because they were so brokenhearted and desperate to see her and were worried that she might die before they got a chance to even just to say hi again. And they ended up getting arrested for kidnapping. Brokenhearted people all throughout this nation. Isaiah spoke to those who were captives and prisoners. Maybe you've been a prisoner of your own mental health during this time. And whilst you've been confined to your house, whilst you've been isolated to your own space, you've also been confined and isolated to your own negative thoughts. And maybe you've been spiraling further and further into depression or suicidal tendencies, and you're just desperate. You're desperate for this lockdown to end so that you can spend time with people again, so that you can talk with people again, so you can just be encouraged by people again, rather than being isolated to your own self-negative thoughts. Isaiah spoke to those who were mourning and grieving as well. Maybe you've had to mourn the loss of a loved one this year. Maybe you've known people who are mourning and grieving the loss of loved ones, the loss of family members, who friends, people who they never had a chance to say goodbye to, whom COVID just took very quickly, and whom they couldn't even attend the funeral of. And how do you mourn and how do you grieve when these practical ways of mourning and grieving are stripped away from us, when all you're left with is just a photo and a memory, just to learn how to mourn and to grieve? Isaiah spoke to those who were in despair. Have we not despaired at our political landscape this year? Have we not despaired at how racism and terrorism and crime could still endure through a pandemic? Have we not despaired at how there's been a lack of unity and a rivalry amongst our political leaders? Have we not despaired at how we were looking for a 5-day Christmas break to spend with our families, and now it's been truncated down to 1 single day? And what can we do with that, to celebrate Christmas on just 1 day with our loved ones? And so we find ourselves in a very similar situation to the Hebrew people at this time, going through a very dark period, going through a very distressing period. And like Jamie joked earlier, it's one that we want to have behind us. And yet in this time of distress and uncertainty for the Hebrews, God responded. You see, in the darkness, a light came, a voice came, and God responded. God did not just leave them in their distress and their suffering, but he sent a man with a message of hope to the Hebrews. He sent Isaiah with a message of hope, because it says that Isaiah came to preach good news to the poor. Good news. He came to bind up the brokenhearted. He came to proclaim freedom for the captives, to release the prisoners from darkness, to comfort all who mourn, to provide for those who grieve, to give them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, to give them the oil of gladness instead of mourning, and to provide them a garment of praise instead of despair. You see, God's answer to those who were distressed, to those who were uncertain, to those who were lonely and broken and suffering, was one of hope. It was one of love. It was one of comfort. To those who were in darkness, to those who were going through a distressing and a hard time, God came to them and said, hey, I'm here. You can have hope. God responded to those who were suffering. And likewise, God comes to us in our moments of darkness. God comes to us in our moments of distress and says, hey, you can have hope. I am here. We just heard from Barbara about how God came to her and gave her hope and strength during one of the most difficult times in her life. Losing her husband tragically, traumatically at home. And yet God gave her the strength. God showed her love and peace and joy, even through one of the darkest times of her life. And maybe that's you tonight. Maybe you're watching online or you're here physically, and that rings a bell for you or for someone that you know that, hey, that's me. I'm going through a pretty dark time in my life that people don't even know about. And yet God's arms are open and he's saying, hey, I've got hope if you want to come to me. You know, in many ways, this is why God came to the world as a man through Jesus Christ, so he could empathize with our humanity, so that he could save us from our brokenness. Because believe it or not, Jesus experienced all of the trauma. Jesus experienced all of the hardship, all of the toil that we experience in life and that we've especially experienced this year. You know, Jesus knew poverty. I mean, for goodness sake, Jesus was born in a stable and his parents laid him in a feeding trough. I mean, anyone who can, quote that story to the origin of their life is a pretty good story to tell. I mean, who can claim that? But yet Jesus could. Jesus' life wasn't marked by one of comfort and luxury and riches. It was one marked more by poverty. Jesus experienced a broken heart and grief as well. When he lost one of his good friends to ill health, he publicly and unashamedly wept. It's where we get the shortest verse in the Bible from. John 11, verse 35. It just says, Jesus wept. He wept. He empathizes with our humanity. He knows what grief feels like. He knows what mourning feels like. He knows what feeling his best mate feels like. Jesus experienced trialing thoughts and tempting situations. You know, the night before he died, he was so racked with anxiety that it says that the sweat drops from his forehead were like drops of blood, because he was so filled with anxiety about what he was going to face the next day. So he knows what it is to come underneath pressure. He knows what it is to come underneath anxious thoughts and heavy situations. And so God is the God who meets us where we are at. Why? Because he knows where we are at. Why? Because he has been where we are at. God is the God who empathizes with our humanity so that he can save us from our very brokenness. Yet it's not just even that. God's hope for humanity is not just to comfort us in our distress. It's not just to provide comfort in healing when we are painful, when we are suffering. It's not even just that, to get us up to a neutral point. You see, God has an even higher hope for humanity even above that. The last verse that Skylar just read in the passage before, it says, at the end of this passage in Isaiah, it says, they will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord for the display of his splendor. You see, God's hope for humanity is that we would be like solid oak trees of righteousness who display his glorious splendor. You know, like how in autumn, when the trees burst forth in glorious color, when you see all the amazing colors scattered around and we just marvel at it. Well, so that is God's hope for humanity. God's hope for humanity is that we would join with him in displaying and bursting forth his goodness, his grace, his love, his mercy and compassion throughout all the world. And yet it's not the human spirit, it's the God spirit, is that we display his splendor, not our splendor, is that we display his goodness, not our goodness, but he is the one who strengthens us and motivates us to do that. That is the higher hope to which God is calling us. That is his higher hope for humanity. Not that we would just be comforted in our distress, but that we would join his team in displaying his goodness throughout the world. So never mind your hopes for this year. Let's just forget about this year, right? What are your hopes for life itself? What are your hopes for the next few years? Hopefully COVID will go away at some point, you know. What are your hopes and what are your ambitions? What do you hope to see? What do you hope to gain in life? You see, one of our highest hopes and our ambitions in life is just to live a happy, comfortable life, you know, with friends and with family. Hey, maybe even to top it off, maybe make a positive contribution to society. Were they not good? They're not bad or wrong desires. They're good. They're great. But even these good and these noble desires fall so very short of the amazing hope that God has for us. I mean, settling for something so simple as that is like settling for like a KFC when you've been invited to like a 5-course banquet at the poshest restaurant that you know, the Savoy in London. You just wouldn't do that. But yet God has such a higher hope for us to live for. God has such a higher purpose for us to live for than just to live for ourselves, to live for something so far greater. So how about instead join God's team in displaying his splendor, his grace and his goodness throughout all of the world? And whilst you're at it, filling up yourselves with his hope and his comfort. 700 years later in first century Israel, a man about my age, about 30 years old, he walked into a synagogue and he read this very same passage, Isaiah 61. He read it out amongst his listeners. And then he came to his listeners and he said, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." And that man was Jesus of Nazareth. You see, it turns out that the words of Isaiah weren't actually the words of Isaiah. They were the words of the Messiah, Jesus Christ. Isaiah was kind of predicting or speaking forward, as in that the words of the Messiah, the words of Jesus who would come so many years later. But why? Because Jesus came for the hurting and the broken. Jesus came for the distressed and the uncertain. He came for me and for you. He came to set the record straight. He came to pay for our sin. He came to give us hope in our darkness. Jesus' words to us were, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." They were Jesus' words. You can look them up in the Gospels. And I don't know about you, but I feel pretty weary and burdened after this year, right? I don't know about you, but I could do with some rest for my soul after this year. So at the end of what has been a hopeless year, put your hope in a higher hope. Put your hope in the person who holds the very message of hope. Why? Because it turns out hope has a name. It turns out love has a name. It turns out joy has a name. Peace has a name, and his name is Jesus Christ. He is our living hope. He has a purpose for us to live for. He has a hope for us to live for in displaying his goodness throughout all the world. He has empathized with our brokenness. He has empathized with our pain, with our suffering, our distress, and our loss. And he says, "Hey, I have hope. So come and find your peace in me. Come and find your love in me. Come and find your joy in me. And join my team in displaying that throughout all of the world." That sounds like a great hope to me. And I invite you to make that choice tonight, to put your hope in Jesus. I have, Barbara did, many in this room have, and it's the best choice I ever made.